The steam from my Earl Grey rose in a thin, unwavering line, undisturbed by the shouting. My son, David, stood in my foyer, his face a frantic shade of red I hadn't seen since he was 6, and losing a game of checkers. Beside him, his wife, Chloe, held her designer handbag like a shield, her eyes darting toward the mahogany sideboard, as if she were already mentally tagging the silver for an estate sale. David's voice cracked when he delivered the ultimatum he'd clearly rehearsed in the car. He told me I was overbearing, that my old-fashioned expectations were a shadow over their marriage, and then he said the words he thought would break me. He told me they were moving, they were changing their numbers, and that I should not look for them because I was no longer family. I didn't set my cup down. I didn't even blink. I simply watched a small bead of condensation slide down the cream pitcher and realized that the silence following his declaration wasn't heavy, it was a gift. When people offer you an exit from their lives, the most elegant thing you can do is take it and lock the door behind them. I am a woman who understands the weight of a signature. I wasn't handed this house or the portfolio that maintains it by a benefactor or a stroke of luck. I spent 34 years in logistics and supply chain management, starting when women in the front office were expected to be invisible. I built a firm that specialized in finding the cracks in contracts, the tiny, overlooked clauses that determine who eats and who starves when a shipment goes missing. I learned early on that passion is a noise made by people who haven't done their homework. While my peers were buying sports cars to signal their success, I was buying boring commercial real estate and diversifying into irrevocable trusts. I don't fund dreams, and I certainly don't subsidize entitlement. I fund infrastructure. I had spent decades building a bridge for my son to walk across, never imagining he would try to burn it while he was still standing in the middle of it. The betrayal wasn't the shouting, it was the assumption of my weakness. I had seen the shift months ago. It was in the way Chloe stopped asking how I was and started asking about the maintenance costs of my properties. It was in the way David stopped visiting for Sunday dinner and started sending me links to luxury-assisted living communities that looked more like gilded cages. They thought I was a softening mountain, eroding under the weather of my years. They assumed that because I am a grandmother, my love is a blank check that requires no accountability. David's final words were meant to be a sentence of loneliness, but to a woman who has read 1,000 contracts, they were a formal notice of termination. They wanted total independence from my interference, yet they were still driving cars registered to my LLC and living in a townhouse held by my family trust. They wanted the fruit without the labor of honoring the root. I waited until I heard their tires crunch over the gravel driveway before I walked to my study. I didn't cry. I didn't call a friend to vent. I sat at my desk, clicked on my banker's lamp, and pulled the blue leather binder from the safe. There is a specific kind of peace found in a well-organized file. I spent the night reviewing the terms of the discretionary spending accounts I had set up for them. I reread the lease agreement for the townhouse, noting with a cold precision that the family occupancy clause was predicated on a harmonious relationship with the trust grantor. My silence that night wasn't an absence of action. It was the quiet before a structural collapse. I spent 6 hours documenting every missed check-in and every documented instance of their stated intent to sever ties. If I was no longer family, then I was no longer a benefactor. I was simply a landlord and a creditor, and I have never been known for my leniency with strangers. By 8 a.m. the next morning, the quiet power they had underestimated was in full motion. I didn't send a spiteful text. I sent 3 emails. The first was to the property management firm, instructing them to issue a 30-day notice to quit for the townhouse, as the qualifying terms of the trust had been breached. The second was to the dealership to initiate the repossession of the 2 vehicles held under my corporate fleet insurance. The third was to my accountant, closing the supplemental lifestyle accounts that covered their country club dues and private school tuitions. I wasn't taking anything from them. I was simply returning them to the reality they claimed to want. When the foundation of a house is removed, the collapse isn't an act of vengeance. It's a law of physics. They wanted a life without me, so I gave them exactly what they asked for, a life funded entirely by themselves. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had to let the paperwork speak for you when your words were ignored? Have you ever realized that your generosity was actually being treated as a subsidy for someone's disrespect? Have you ever had to be the bad guy simply because you started enforcing the rules people thought didn't apply to them? Subscribe to Vintage Vengeance. The silence in my study was absolute, the kind of quiet that feels like a polished stone. It was 48 hours after I had signed the final revocation papers, and the first wave of the storm had finally hit my front door. My phone had been vibrating on the blotter for 20 minutes, David's name flashing over and over, a frantic digital heartbeat. I didn't answer. I didn't even turn the screen over. I simply watched the light pulse against the dark wood of my desk, a silent reminder that when you tell someone you are no longer family, you lose the right to their ear. I was busy reviewing the quarterly earnings of my commercial holdings, a task that required a clarity he no longer deserved to disrupt. He wasn't calling to apologize for the exile he had tried to impose on me. He was calling because the corporate gas card had been declined at a premium pump, and the reality of his independence was starting to smell like exhaust. I have always believed that if you want to know the true character of a man, you don't look at how he treats his superiors. You look at how he handles a sudden loss of unearned comfort. David had grown up in the amber glow of my success, attending schools where the grass was manicured weekly and the tuition was higher than the median household income. He mistook my provision for a natural law like gravity or the rising sun. He forgot that the sun only shines on him because I own the sky he stands under. My career in logistics taught me that every delivery has a cost, and every contract has a termination clause. I didn't raise him to be a prince, but I suppose I pampered him into believing the kingdom was his by right of birth rather than by right of character. He viewed my discipline as an antique burden, something to be discarded the moment he found a wife who whispered that he was being controlled by a woman who merely asked for respect. The second wave of the betrayal came not in a shout, but in a legal letter delivered by a courier 2 hours after the phone calls stopped. Chloe's father is a lawyer of the loud suit and louder billboards variety, and the letter was a masterpiece of desperate overreach. It claimed that the townhouse was a gift in lieu of inheritance and that my sudden retraction of support constituted emotional elder abuse, a phrase so ironic it nearly made me pour a second glass of sherry. They weren't just leaving, they were trying to litigate their way into my pockets on their way out the door. They assumed that because I am 70, I would be frightened by a letterhead and a few Latin phrases. They forgot that I am the woman who negotiated union contracts in the 80s while holding a toddler in one arm and a ledger in the other. I don't fear lawyers. I employ them to keep my garden tidy. I spent the rest of the afternoon in what I call the war room, a small climate-controlled basement office, where I keep the physical backups of every transaction I've made since 1985. It is a cathedral of paper. While David and Chloe were likely posting curated photos of their new beginning on social media, I was pulling the original, notarized occupancy agreement they had signed 4 years ago. I found the addendum, the one David had signed in his own hand, acknowledging that the townhouse remained an asset of the Eleanor Vance Irrevocable Trust, and that residency was at the sole discretion of the trustee. I didn't call my own attorney yet. I simply scanned the document, saved it as a high-resolution PDF, and sat in the stillness. Anger is a leak in a pressurized system. I prefer to stay airtight. I was looking for the precise moment to let the weight of their own signatures crush their ambitions. The consequence of their arrogance arrived on a Tuesday morning in the form of a flatbed truck. Because the SUV David drove was registered to my logistics firm as a consultant vehicle, and because I had terminated his consultancy for cause, specifically his stated intent to cease all communication and professional affiliation, the vehicle was technically being operated without authorization. I didn't call the police. I simply called the recovery service I've used for 20 years for fleet management. Watching the car being hoisted onto the bed from my upstairs window was a lesson in physics. What goes up on my dime comes down on mine as well. David came running out of the house in his bathrobe, waving his arms, a ghost of the man I thought I had raised. He looked small against the backdrop of the neighborhood he couldn't afford to live in without me. He looked exactly like what he was, a tenant who had forgotten to pay the rent of common decency. I am not a cruel woman, but I am a precise one. Cruelty is personal. Precision is professional. By noon, the locksmiths I had hired were changing the codes on the townhouse, and the local private school had received a formal notice that the upcoming semester's tuition would not be wired from the trust. I wasn't cutting them off. Out of spite, I was simply honoring David's request to be no longer family. If we are strangers, then we deal in the currency of strangers. Cash up front, no credit extended, and no favors asked. The look on his face when he realized the gate code no longer worked was not the look of a man who had won his freedom. It was the look of a man who had realized that the boundaries he set were actually the walls of a cage he had built for himself. That morning was the quietest of all. I sat on my veranda, watching the sunrise paint the oak trees in shades of amber and gold. My phone sat face down on the wicker table, a silent brick of glass and metal. I knew the digital world was screaming. Emails from Chloe's father, frantic texts from David's old college friends, perhaps even a few social media vague posts about family abandonment. I didn't look. In my line of work, you learn that a fire without oxygen eventually starves. By refusing to engage in the heat of their panic, I was effectively removing the air from their room. I wasn't hiding. I was simply unavailable for a conversation that had already reached its logical conclusion. Silence isn't just the absence of noise. It is a strategic vacuum that forces the other party to face the echo of their own voice. I am a woman who was forged in the high-pressure boilers of the 1980s logistics industry. I started as a dispatcher, sitting in a trailer that smelled of diesel and stale coffee, coordinating 500 trucks with nothing but a landline and a legal pad. I didn't get ahead by being nice or by fitting in. I got ahead because I was the only person in the room who knew exactly where every penny was leaking out of the hull. I learned that people will promise you the moon when they need a shipment moved, and they will curse your name when the invoice arrives. I survived by never taking the praise or the insults personally. To me, David's outburst wasn't a heartbreak. It was a logistics failure. He was a delivery that had been rerouted by a third party, his wife. And my job was no longer to ensure he arrived safely, but to mitigate the loss to the parent company. The confirmation of his true intent arrived not through a lawyer, but through a discovery in my own digital archives. While I was auditing the family cloud storage, an account I pay for and manage, I found a folder Chloe had inadvertently synced to the shared documents drive. It was titled Renovations and Refinancing. Inside were architectural renderings for my home. They hadn't just been waiting for me to pass away. They had been actively planning to gut the library I spent 30 years filling, turning it into a minimalist yoga studio. There were notes on the resale value of my jewelry and a spreadsheet calculating how much they could squeeze out of a reverse mortgage on my properties. They weren't just seeking independence. They were conducting a hostile takeover of a living woman's estate. Seeing those blueprints didn't make me cry. It made me sharpen my pencil. I spent the afternoon at my mahogany desk, not with a box of tissues, but with a stack of ledgers. I didn't call to confront David about the yoga studio plans. I didn't send a scathing email about his greed. Instead, I spent 4 hours meticulously reviewing the repayment of education clauses I had embedded in the trust years ago. Most parents think of college tuition as a gift. I think of it as a conditional investment in the family's intellectual capital. There was a small, elegant paragraph on page 12 of the trust bylaws. Should a beneficiary voluntarily terminate their familial status and legal association with the grantor, any discretionary educational grants would be reclassified as low-interest personal loans, due in full upon the dissolution of said relationship. David hadn't just walked away from his mother. He had walked away from his primary creditor. The consequence was a mathematical inevitability. I didn't have to raise my voice to make them feel the weight of their choices. By Wednesday afternoon, the bank had processed the formal reclassification of the accounts. I sat in my garden, pruning the roses, while 3 towns away, David was likely opening a registered letter informing him that he was now $64,000 in debt to the Eleanor Vance Trust. I didn't do it to be mean. I did it because structure requires balance. They wanted to be no longer family. And in the world of business, there is no such thing as a free education from a stranger. I watched a ladybug crawl across a petal and felt a profound sense of equilibrium. The chaos they had tried to bring into my foyer had been converted into a series of manageable, legally binding line items. When people show you who they are, believe them, but when they show you what they intend to take, stop them. I am not a victim of a toxic family dynamic. I am the architect of a secure perimeter. The house felt larger that evening, the air cleaner, as if the very walls were exhaling the tension of the last few years. My son and his wife had assumed that my love was a weakness they could exploit until the end. They didn't realize that my love is a structure, and like any well-built structure, it has a foundation that can be retracted if the occupants prove to be a threat to the integrity of the building. I am not lonely in this silence. I am merely at peace. The sound of a doorbell, persistent and jagged, breaking the stillness of my 7 a.m. coffee. I didn't get up. I knew from the feed on my security monitor that it was David standing on my porch without the polished veneer of his usual corporate confidence. He was wearing a rumpled shirt and a look of panicked indignation. He knew I was home. The light in the kitchen was a deliberate signal of my presence. But a closed door is a physical manifestation of a boundary, and I had no intention of opening it. I watched him through the screen of my tablet as he paced the length of the veranda, his shadow long and frantic against the stone. He was shouting at the doorbell camera now, his voice muffled by the heavy oak, demanding to know how I could legally do this to him. I took a slow sip of my tea. He was looking for an argument, a scene, a moment of maternal guilt he could manipulate. I gave him the only thing that cannot be argued with: a locked door and a silent house. I am a woman who spent decades navigating the cold, hard world of industrial logistics, where a delay in a port or a missing bill of lading can cost a company millions. In that world, you don't survive by being kind to people who fail to meet their contractual obligations. You survive by being reliable and holding others to the same standard. I didn't build my life on vibes or intentions. I built it on the ironclad reliability of the written word. When David was growing up, I made sure he understood that every privilege had a corresponding responsibility. I didn't realize that as he reached adulthood, he had begun to view those responsibilities as optional, a mere suggestion from an aging woman who didn't understand the modern world. He thought my quietness was a sign of my fading relevance. He forgot that the most powerful engines in the world are often the ones you can't hear. The review of the files continued long after David gave up and drove away in a rental car that looked far too small for his ego. I moved from the kitchen to my library, pulling the folders related to the consultancy fees I had paid him over the last 3 fiscal years. David had been consulting for my investment firm, a position I created to help him bridge the gap between his modest salary and the lifestyle Chloe demanded. As I laid the invoices out on the long mahogany table, the pattern was clear. He hadn't been consulting. He had been coasting. There were no reports, no market analyses, no deliverables, just a monthly transfer of funds from my business account to his, signed by me out of a sense of legacy. It was a paper trail of my own misplaced generosity. I didn't feel angry as I looked at the numbers. I felt a clinical sense of necessity. The leak had to be plugged. I spent the next few hours in a state of methodical calm. I wasn't just cutting off an allowance. I was auditing a life. I called my lead attorney, a man named Arthur, who has been my shark in a three-piece suit since 1992. I didn't tell him I was hurt or upset. I told him I was realigning my corporate structure and addressing historical overpayments. We discussed the clawback provisions in the consultancy agreement, clauses that allowed for the recovery of fees if the services promised were never rendered. David had been so sure of my love that he never bothered to actually perform the work I was paying him for. He had treated my business like a personal ATM, and now the ATM was demanding a receipt. Silence is a powerful tool, but documentation is a weapon. The consequence of this review was delivered via a formal demand letter that arrived at David's temporary address by late afternoon. It wasn't a letter about family or forgiveness. It was a formal demand for the return of $42,000 in unearned consultancy fees, citing the lack of any documented work product for the preceding 18 months. I could almost hear the scream from across the city. The townhouse notice was a blow to their comfort. The tuition cutoff was a blow to their status, but a demand for the return of cash already spent, that was a blow to their survival. I wasn't being toxic or vengeful. I was simply applying the same auditing standards to my son that I would apply to any failing vendor. If he wanted to be a stranger, I would treat him with the cold, professional scrutiny a stranger deserves. By evening, the sun set in a bruise-colored sky, and I felt a profound sense of relief. The structure of my life was being restored, brick by brick, signature by signature. People think that setting boundaries is a loud, emotional process, but for those of us who have lived long enough to know better, it is a quiet, administrative one. You don't have to shout to be heard when you hold the pen that signs the checks. I sat in my darkened library, the only light coming from the street lamp outside, and realized that I hadn't felt this light in years. The weight of supporting people who didn't respect me had been a burden I didn't even know I was carrying until I set it down. I arrived with a notification from my security system. A car had entered the driveway at 6 a.m., but it wasn't the rental. It was a silver sedan I recognized as Chloe's mother's car. I watched the grainy footage on my bedside monitor as Chloe stepped out, her face stripped of its usual curated perfection. She wasn't carrying a legal threat this time. She was carrying a peace offering, a basket of expensive muffins, and a look of practiced contrition. She stood at the door and knocked softly, a stark contrast to David's frantic pounding the day before. I didn't move. I lay in my high-thread count sheets, listening to the chime of the doorbell echoing through the empty halls. She stayed for 40 minutes, sitting on the wicker bench, her shoulders hunched as she realized the grandmother wisdom she had mocked as obsolete was currently the only thing standing between her and a cramped two-bedroom apartment. I didn't ignore her because I was angry. I ignored her because a bridge that has been intentionally collapsed cannot be crossed with a basket of muffins. I am a woman who spent half her life in boardrooms where empathy was often used as a tactical mask for incompetence. I've seen men cry when their bonuses were cut, and women plead for just one more chance after missing a critical deadline. In every instance, the numbers didn't care about their feelings. The ledger is a cold, honest mirror. I built my wealth by being the person who looked in that mirror every day. I didn't raise David to be a victim of circumstance. I raised him in an environment of absolute stability so that he would have the strength to build his own. Somewhere along the way, he confused my stability with his own capability. He mistook the safety net for the floor. My life has been a series of calculated risks and meticulous preparations, and the greatest miscalculation I ever made was assuming my son had inherited my respect for the foundation. The review of the fifth day was the most granular of all. I opened the file marked personal property and assets. When David moved into the townhouse, I had allowed him to borrow several pieces of high-end furniture and art from my storage facility, items intended to stay in the family for generations. There was a Regency-era writing desk, a set of hand-woven Persian rugs, and a small but significant collection of landscape oils. In his "Don't Look for Us" speech, he had neglected to mention how he planned to return these items. Or perhaps, more likely, he had already forgotten they weren't his. I sat at my desk and drafted a very specific inventory list. I didn't call to ask for them back. I simply attached the original insurance riders, which listed the Eleanor Vance Trust as the sole owner, to a formal request for return of property. The consequence was a quiet, logistical surgical strike. I didn't send a moving crew to cause a scene in their neighborhood. Instead, I contacted the insurance carrier. I informed them that the items were no longer at the primary secured location and that I could no longer vouch for their safety in the hands of non-affiliated third parties. The insurance company, terrified of a claim on a six-figure inventory, did exactly what I knew they would. They sent a formal notice to David and Chloe stating that the items must be returned to a bonded warehouse within 48 hours, or they would be reported as unlawfully retained. The beauty of a structural consequence is that I don't have to be the bad guy. The policy is the bad guy. The contract is the bad guy. I am simply the woman who follows the rules. I watched through the window of my library as the sun hit the spines of my books, feeling the immense power of a life lived without the need for permission. By late afternoon, I received an automated alert. The lifestyle credit card I had forgotten to cancel, the one David used for his business lunches, had been flagged for a $400 charge at a high-end steakhouse. He was clearly trying to have one last meal on my dime before the reality of his independence fully set in. I didn't call the restaurant to embarrass him. I simply logged into the portal and pressed "Report Lost or Stolen." The card was deactivated instantly. I imagine the look on his face when the waiter returned with a declined slip was far more educational than any lecture I could have given him. It wasn't about the $400. It was about the fact that he was no longer authorized to breathe my air. I am simply stopping the flow of resources to a project that has proven to be a poor investment. Some people think that family means you have to endure being diminished, but a woman who knows her worth knows that family is a title earned through loyalty, not a right granted by blood. The following morning brought a different kind of weather, a cold, persistent drizzle that matched the clinical state of my ledgers. I sat in my sunroom, watching the rain blur the edges of the estate, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to check my watch. Usually, this was the hour I spent managing David's emergencies, his late property taxes, his car maintenance, the school fees he'd forgotten to pay. My life had been a series of fires I didn't start, but was always expected to extinguish. But today, the only fire in the house was the one in my hearth. I watched a notification pop up on my tablet. David had sent a long, rambling email with the subject line, "Can we just be reasonable?" I didn't open it. In my experience, when someone who has been profoundly unreasonable starts asking for reason, what they are actually asking for is a concession. They don't want a middle ground. They want the ground you're standing on. I am a woman who spent the better part of the 90s restructuring failing manufacturing firms. I know what a sunk cost looks like. In business, You learn to identify the moment an asset becomes a liability, and you stop pouring capital into a hole that has no bottom. I had spent 30 years treating David like an asset, assuming that with enough time and investment, he would yield a return of character and loyalty. The "don't look for us" speech was the final audit. It revealed that he had no equity in our relationship, only debt. I wasn't just his mother. I had been his chief financial officer, his human resources department, and his legal counsel. When he fired me from the role of family, he didn't realize he was also losing the entire back office infrastructure that kept his life from collapsing under the weight of his own poor choices. The review on the 6th day focused on the legacy accounts. These were the small, thoughtful trusts I had established for my grandchildren's future. Chloe and David had often spoken of these accounts as if they were an extension of their own checking balances. They had even attempted to borrow against them for their kitchen remodel, a request I had denied with a silent, firm shake of my head. I sat at my desk and pulled the trust deeds. Each account was structured with a discretionary distribution clause, meaning I, as the grantor, had the final say on how and when that money was spent. More importantly, they were contingent on maintaining a meaningful and supportive relationship with the estate. I didn't close the children's accounts. I would never punish the innocent for the sins of the arrogant, but I did move them. I transferred the management to a third-party institutional trustee in a different state. The consequence was a complete loss of visibility. By midday, David would have realized he no longer had login access to view those balances. He could no longer see the safety net that he thought he could fall back on if his new, independent life didn't pan out. I didn't send a letter explaining the move. I simply let the "access denied" screen do the talking. It was the digital version of a locked door. To David and Chloe, that money was a trophy they hadn't won yet. To me, it was a responsibility they weren't ready for. By removing their ability to see the money, I was removing their ability to spend it in their minds. The psychological impact of not knowing is often more effective than the physical impact of a loss. They were finally beginning to understand that independence means standing on your own 2 feet, not standing on my shoulders while spitting on my head. By 4 p.m., the senior justice I was administering felt like a quiet, cleansing rain. I received a frantic call from my daughter-in-law's mother, trying to mediate. She spoke of forgiveness and the holiday season, using the kind of soft, manipulative language people use when they want you to subsidize someone else's disrespect. I listened for exactly 2 minutes. Then I spoke for 10 seconds. I told her that if David and Chloe wanted a mediator, they could have their attorney contact mine, but that as a private citizen who was no longer family, I had no obligation to host strangers for the holidays. I hung up before she could respond. The silence that followed was exquisite. I wasn't being cruel, I was being consistent. If I am not your family, I am not your host. If I am not your mother, I am not your banker. Dignity is the armor you wear when people try to use your heart against your head. It is the ability to say no without a tremor in your voice, even when the world tells you that you should be softer. I am not a soft woman. I am a solid one. And a solid woman knows that you cannot build a life on the shifting sands of someone else's entitlement. I spent the evening in my library reading a book on 18th century architecture, enjoying the fact that my mind was finally free to focus on something other than my son's latest crisis. The quiet power of my position isn't in what I can do to them, but in what I no longer have to do for them. That next morning, I brought a delivery that was not for me, but was a direct result of me. A courier arrived at my gate, and through the intercom, I instructed him to leave the documents in the secure drop box. They were the final reports from the forensic audit of the property taxes for the townhouse. In my son's haste to declare his independence, he had forgotten that I had been paying the property taxes through my holding company to take advantage of specific corporate deductions. Since David had officially stated I was no longer family, I had simply removed the townhouse from the company's employee housing list. The city, ever efficient when it comes to revenue, had immediately reassessed the property as a non-commercial, non-exempt private residence. The bill for the back taxes, now due in full, was a 5-figure nightmare waiting on David's doorstep. I didn't send a warning. In the world of finance, the absence of a subsidy is not an act of aggression. It is merely the restoration of reality. I am a woman who built her first warehouse during a recession when interest rates were high enough to make a grown man weep. I learned then that there is no such thing as free money. There is only money that hasn't been accounted for yet. I spent years watching David and Chloe treat my wealth like a natural resource, something they could mine, without ever worrying about the environmental impact on our relationship. They viewed my grandmother wisdom as a quaint collection of recipes and platitudes, never realizing that my wisdom was actually a complex system of risk management. I didn't get to this age by being lucky. I got here by being the person who always had a plan B, C, and D. They, on the other hand, had built their entire life on the assumption that my plan A would last forever. The review of the 7th day was a deep dive into the digital estate. Because I am the one who pays for the family's high-speed fiber internet, the cellular data plans, and the premium cloud subscriptions, I am the administrator of their digital lives. I sat in my study and systematically began the process of decoupling. I didn't delete their photos or wipe their emails. I am not a vandal. I simply moved their lines of service to a pending transfer status. This meant that within 24 hours, their phones would cease to function unless they provided their own credit card and assumed the full, non-discounted monthly rate. It is a small thing, perhaps, but it is a visceral one. Nothing makes a person feel the weight of their own independence quite like the sudden disappearance of a 5G signal. The consequence was a masterclass in quiet, technical inevitability. I received a notification that David had tried to log into the family's streaming accounts, the ones he used to let his children watch movies on rainy afternoons. He found the password had been changed. He tried the home security app for the townhouse, only to find his credentials had been revoked. I wasn't doing this to be petty. I was doing it to be thorough. If I am no longer family, then I have no reason to provide the soundtrack to your life or the security for your home. By sunset, I imagine the silence in their house was becoming deafening. Without my interference, they were left with nothing but the sound of their own mounting expenses. By 7 p.m., my attorney called to inform me that David had reached out to him, skipping the mediation and going straight to begging. He wanted a grace period. He wanted me to be the bigger person. I told Arthur to remind him of his own words. Don't look for us. I told Arthur to explain that the bigger person is usually just the one who has been walked on the most, and I have retired from that position. I wasn't being cold. I was being clear. A grace period is for someone who made a mistake. David made a declaration. When you tell a woman she is no longer family, you are essentially telling her that her obligations to you have ended. I am simply a woman who is very good at honoring my obligations, especially the ones that involve leaving people exactly where they asked to be. I spent the evening on my patio, wrapped in a cashmere throw, watching the stars. The world is a very large place when you aren't carrying the weight of ungrateful people on your back. I am not lonely. I am finally unencumbered. I am a woman of quiet power. And my power comes from the fact that I don't need anything from them, while they need everything from me. This was the first time I felt the house truly belonged to me again. I spent the early hours in my greenhouse, tending to the orchids that require a level of patience David never possessed. While I was misting the delicate petals, my security gate buzzed. It was a process server. I didn't have to meet him. He was there to drop off the formal response to my demand for the return of the trust's property. David and Chloe weren't fighting the return of the furniture anymore. They were asking for an extension because they had nowhere to store it. Apparently, the expansive new life they had envisioned didn't include a floor plan large enough for the legacy they had tried to steal. I didn't grant the extension. I simply directed my attorney to send the address of the bonded warehouse. In logistics, as in life, storage is a line item, not a favor. I am a woman who remembers the smell of the ink on my first business license. I remember the weight of the key to my first office. I have always understood that to own something is to be responsible for it. David, however, was part of a generation that believes ownership is a feeling, not a legal status. He felt he owned the townhouse because he slept there. He felt he owned the cars because he drove them. He felt he owned my time because he was born to me. But feelings don't hold up in a court of law, and they certainly don't satisfy a lien. I didn't get to my position by letting people mistake my kindness for a lack of documentation. I survived the lean years by knowing exactly where the boundaries of my property began and where the entitlement of others ended. The review on the 8th day was the most final of all, the disinheritance amendment. I had avoided this for years, always leaving a door cracked for the possibility of a change in his character. But the blueprints for the yoga studio had been the final straw. They weren't waiting for my love. They were waiting for my departure. I sat in my library with a fresh pen and a heavy heart, though my hand didn't shake. I signed the documents that removed David as the primary beneficiary of the Eleanor Vance estate. The funds were redirected to a scholarship foundation for young women entering the logistics and maritime industries, people who understand that you have to move the weight yourself if you want to get paid. I didn't feel a sense of loss. I felt a sense of completion. The bridge wasn't just closed, it had been dismantled and repurposed for people who actually wanted to cross it. The consequence was a shift in the very atmosphere of our interactions. By late afternoon, David had sent a text that was no longer angry or even pleading. It was hollow. He had received notice from the trust's bank that his contingent interest had been revoked. This was the moment the floor truly disappeared. Up until now, he thought he was just losing his current comfort. Now, he realized he had lost his future. I didn't respond to the text. Silence is the only appropriate response to a man who realizes he has traded his birthright for a moment of unearned ego. I watched the rain stop and the sun break through the clouds, illuminating the library in a way that felt like a benediction. I wasn't being toxic by protecting my legacy. I was being a steward of my own hard work. By 8 p.m., I received a notification that the cars had been successfully recovered and delivered to the corporate lot. The townhouse was scheduled for a final walkthrough in 48 hours. My life was becoming a series of checked boxes, a clean list of resolved issues. I am not a woman who enjoys karma in the sense of wishing ill on others, but I do enjoy the satisfying click of a lock that fits perfectly. David and Chloe wanted a life where I wasn't family. They got it, but they forgot that family was the only reason the bills were being paid. Without that title, they were just two people with bad credit and a lot of expensive furniture they couldn't afford to keep. I am a woman of structure, and that structure has finally been cleared of the rot that was threatening to bring it down. I spent the evening listening to Vivaldi, the music filling the rooms that were once filled with the noise of David's complaints. The quiet power of my silence has done more in 8 days than my words did in 30 years. The day of the final walkthrough, I didn't go myself. In my career, I've learned that the most effective way to handle a failed partnership is to send a neutral, third-party observer who cannot be swayed by tears or tantrums. I sent Arthur's junior associate and a professional bonded appraiser. I stayed home, sitting in my garden with a pair of shears, precisely deadheading the hydrangeas. I didn't need to see the look on David's face as he handed over the keys to the life he had treated like a disposable plaything. My security feed showed the moving truck pulling away, a much smaller one than the one that had brought them there 4 years ago. They were leaving behind the heavy mahogany and the Persian rugs, stripped down to the IKEA furniture they had actually purchased themselves. It was a visual representation of their true net worth. I am a woman who has survived 3 market crashes and a hostile takeover attempt in the late 90s. I know that the most dangerous thing you can do in a negotiation is let the other person know they can hurt you. By never raising my voice, I never gave David the satisfaction of knowing he had drawn blood. He wanted a toxic showdown he could use to justify his departure to his friends. Instead, he got a series of certified letters and a professional appraisal. He wanted a mother he could blame for his failures. Instead, he got a landlord who followed the letter of the law. I built my empire by being the most prepared person in the room, and that preparation included knowing exactly how to dismantle a relationship that was no longer profitable to my spirit. The review of the 9th day was focused on the final reconciliation. The appraiser's report arrived via email by 2 p.m. There was a scratch on the Regency desk and a missing silver serving tray. In the past, I would have waved these things away as family wear and tear. But the rules had changed. I instructed Arthur to deduct the repair costs and the replacement value of the tray from the security deposit, a deposit I had quietly funded myself years ago for tax purposes. It was the ultimate irony. They were being charged out of a fund they didn't even know existed for damages to items they didn't realize they were lucky to have. I wasn't being petty. I was being accurate. If you want the dignity of being a stranger, you must accept the invoices of a stranger. The consequence of their overconfidence was now fully visible. David had tried to call one last time from a new burner-style number. I let it go to voicemail. His message wasn't about love or the children or even the no longer family comment. It was about the reputational damage. Word had traveled through our social circles that David was no longer associated with my firm or the trust. In our world, silence speaks louder than a scandal. People didn't need to be told why. They only needed to see the locks being changed and the cars being repossessed to know that David had lost the one thing that made him relevant, my endorsement. He was finding out that when you cut off the root, the branch doesn't just stop growing. It withers in public. By 6 p.m., I had the final keys in my possession. They sat on my desk, a small, cold heap of brass and plastic. The townhouse was empty, the accounts were decoupled, and the legacy was protected. I felt a sense of quiet justice that no shouting match could ever provide. I had set a boundary so firm that it had its own gravitational pull. David and Chloe had wanted to see what life looked like without my interference, and I had granted them that vision in high definition. They were now free to build their yoga studio and their independent life, provided they could find a bank willing to lend to a man with a fresh $60,000 debt to his mother's estate. I arrived with a stillness so profound it felt like a deliberate choice by the world. I sat at my kitchen table, the one David had sat at as a boy, and the one he had stood over as a man to tell me I was no longer family. The house was empty of his noise, Chloe's perfume, and the constant, buzzing vibration of their needs. I spent the first hour of the day simply breathing in the scent of cedar and floor wax. I had reclaimed my space, my assets, and my future. I looked at the final stack of folders on my desk, the closed files of a life I was no longer subsidizing. My weapons were never words. They were the slow, methodical turning of pages and the cold, clean stroke of a fountain pen. I am a woman who understands that the true measure of power is not in what you can grab, but in what you can let go. I didn't spend 40 years in the cutthroat world of international logistics to be outmaneuvered by a son who thought a loud voice could replace a solid foundation. I built my life on the principle that if you take care of the structure will take care of you. I didn't lose a son this week. I lost a liability. I gained back the hours I spent worrying about his lack of vision and the thousands of dollars I spent fueling his lack of discipline. I am 70 years old, and for the first time, my energy is entirely my own. I don't fund dreams anymore. I fund my own tranquility. The final review was the most personal of all. I walked through the house, room by room, looking at the empty spaces where the borrowed furniture had once sat. There was a rectangular patch of lighter wood on the floor where the Persian rug had been. I didn't see a void. I saw an opportunity for something new. I sat in my library and pulled a fresh piece of stationery. I didn't write to David. I didn't write to Chloe. I wrote a letter to the foundation I had endowed, detailing my intent to mentor the next generation of women who know that standing on your own 2 feet is the only way to ensure you never have to beg. I wasn't being a cold mother. I was being a responsible elder, ensuring my hard-earned resources went to those who respect the sweat it took to accumulate them. The consequence for David and Chloe is now their permanent reality. They are living in a world where every bill is their own, every mistake is their own, and every silence is a reminder of the woman they thought they could discard. I received a final report from Arthur. David had tried to dispute the clawback of the consultancy fees, but the lack of a single sent email or report during his tenure made his case laughably thin. He is now learning the hardest lesson of all, that an inheritance is a gift, but a salary is earned, and respect is the currency that buys you a seat at the table. They wanted to be no longer family, and I have honored that request with the absolute, unwavering precision of a diamond-tipped blade. By sunset, I stood on my balcony, watching the long shadows stretch across the lawn. The estate was secure. The paperwork was filed. The silence was doing its work, settling into the cracks and corners of my life like a protective seal. I am not bitter because bitterness is a weight, and I have spent this week shedding weights. I am not lonely because a woman who is her own best company is never truly alone. Dignity was restored not through a dramatic confrontation, but through the quiet, inevitable math of a life lived with boundaries. Dignity is the ability to close a door and never look through the keyhole to see who is standing on the other side. It is the understanding that you are the author of your own story, and you have every right to edit out the characters who no longer serve the plot. I am the architect of my own peace, and the foundation is stronger than it has ever been. Some people think they can burn a bridge and still expect the person on the other side to keep the lights on for them. But a woman of quiet power knows that once the bridge is gone, the lights are for her alone. Structure is the only thing that survives when the emotions fade. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had to let the paperwork speak the final word so you could finally have some peace? Thank you for following my journey here on Vintage Vengeance. Subscribe for daily stories of quiet power, setting boundaries, and the senior justice that comes to those who wait.